Welcome to our deep dive, into Michel Foucault's The History of Sexuality, Volume 1.
Oh, a fascinating choice.
Yeah, it's we're going to be exploring, just some excerpts from this book, and I think you'll find that Foucault's work it really challenges, I think, some common assumptions that we have about the history of sexuality, in Western societies.
Definitely.
And it's definitely an academic work.
It is.
But we're going to try to break it down and make it as engaging and accessible as possible for you.
Yeah, Foucault, he had a way of taking things that we thought we understood, like sexuality, and kind of turning our thinking upside down.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And one of the best examples of that, I think, is his concept of the repressive hypothesis, which is kind of where we'll start.
Right.
And so what Foucault is saying is that, contrary to what a lot of people think, Western societies haven't just repressed sexuality.
Yeah.
Instead, they've created these really complex systems for discussing and controlling it.
It's like instead of silencing sexuality, we've built these elaborate structures to talk about it, to categorize it, and ultimately to exert power over it.
Yes.
It's less like a dam holding back a river and more like an intricate system of canals and locks.
Oh, interesting.
Directing the flow of water in very specific ways.
That's such a great analogy.
Oh, good.
It really helps to visualize how Foucault saw power operating.
Yeah.
Not just through repression, but through shaping and channeling our desires.
Yeah.
Now, a common narrative that you hear about this is, the Victorian regime being this era of intense sexual repression.
Oh, yeah.
But Foucault kind of challenges that.
Right.
He's not saying that repression doesn't exist.
Right.
But he's pushing us to ask, why are we so focused on this idea of repression?
Right.
What does this constant talk about being repressed actually achieve? And, whose interests does it serve?
Right.
That's a great point. And that leads us to another really interesting observation that Foucault makes.
Yeah.
And that is this shift in discourse around the 16th century.
Okay.
So before that, there was relative silence about sex, especially, during the Middle Ages. And then suddenly it's like everyone wants to talk about it.
Yeah.
But in very particular ways.
Right. Yeah. This is what he calls the putting into discourse of sex.
Yeah.
And he really highlights the rise of confession and not just confessing actions, but also thoughts and desires as well.
Yeah.
Especially within the Catholic Church.
Yeah. And it's fascinating how that confessional model then expanded beyond just the religious sphere and into other power structures like medicine and education.
Well, think about it. You go to the doctor and they ask you all sorts of personal questions.
Oh, yeah.
About your sexual history.
Right.
Or in school, you're taught about sex in a very specific way that often emphasizes what's considered normal and abnormal.
Yeah.
These are all examples of how this confessional model has become ingrained in our society.
And Foucault's point is that it's not just about judging sex as good or bad.
Exactly.
But about managing it and administering it.
It's about classifying it.
Yeah.
Labeling it.
Right.
And ultimately controlling it.
And this leads us to the emergence of what Foucault calls, these peripheral sexualities.
Yeah.
And we're talking about the rise of the idea of perversions in the 19th century.
Right.
Now, someone might think that this means society was becoming more open and tolerant about different sexualities. Right. But Foucault argues that it actually represents a more intricate method of control.
He's saying that by giving these deviant sexualities a name and categorizing them, you're actually giving them a permanent reality.
Interesting.
And this allows for even more scrutiny and regulation. It's like saying, okay, we acknowledge that these things exist, but now we need to study them, analyze them, and figure out how to manage them.
So it's not about liberation, but about creating new and arguably more insidious forms of control.
Exactly. And this is where his analysis gets really interesting because he links power, pleasure, and this intense focus on these aberrant sexualities.
Right.
For example, he points out how the very act of classifying and studying these perversions can be a source of fascination.
Okay.
And even eroticism.
Wow.
So it's a very interesting
That's making me think differently about how knowledge and power are intertwined.
Yeah.
Especially when it comes to sexuality.
Uh-huh.
It's like the more we try to define and control something,
right.
the more it becomes, an object of fascination and obsession.
Exactly.
And to further understand Foucault's perspective,
okay.
we need to look at his distinction between what he calls scientia sexualis and ars erotica.
Okay.
And this distinction is going to reveal a lot about how discourses on sex have evolved in Western societies. I'm intrigued. So, scientia sexualis refers to this Western science of sexuality, this quest to uncover the objective truth about sex through research and analysis, in contrast to ars erotica, which is more about the ancient, erotic arts, which focused on the experience and the mastery of pleasure.
Right.
Now, think about how these two approaches play out in our understanding of sex. The Western model, with its focus on scientia sexualis, essentially adapts the confessional model that we talked about earlier into a scientific discourse.
Right.
And we see this in the way that sexuality is studied, categorized, and discussed, often through the lens of what's considered normal or abnormal.
It's like the confessional booth has been transformed into the doctor's office or the scientist's lab.
Yeah.
It's still about uncovering hidden truths.
Right.
But now it's done under this guise of objectivity and scientific inquiry.
And this raises an important question about the paradoxical nature of this confessional science.
Right.
It aims for objectivity.
Right.
But it's built on this foundation of personal disclosure and the pursuit of these hidden truths.
That's very interesting.
It makes you wonder if scientia sexualis, despite its claims to objectivity, might actually function as a kind of ars erotica itself.
Foucault certainly suggests that possibility, that the very act of studying and analyzing sex, even in this seemingly objective way, could be a source of pleasure or fascination in and of itself.
That's a really thought-provoking idea.
It is.
And it definitely challenges some of our assumptions about the way we approach the study of sexuality. We can't escape the fact that power and pleasure are always intertwined, even in the most seemingly objective fields of study.
Exactly.
And this exploration of scientia sexualis and ars erotica is really just one piece of Foucault's larger argument about the relationship between power, knowledge, and sexuality.
Right.
To fully grasp his ideas, we need to zoom out and look at his broader view of power itself.
Okay.
So he's saying that the way we typically think about power is something that's held by institutions or individuals who can enforce laws and punish those who disobey is too limited.
Exactly.
Okay.
Foucault argues that these traditional views of power, focusing solely on laws and sovereignty, are inadequate for understanding how power operates in modern societies.
So if power isn't just about this top-down control and punishment, then how does Foucault see it working?
Right.
What are some of these more subtle mechanisms he's talking about?
Well, what's fascinating is that Foucault sees power operating through mechanisms that are often invisible and yet incredibly effective.
Wow.
He argues that power is less about saying no and more about shaping your desires, your behaviors, and even your sense of identity.
So instead of just prohibiting things outright,
it's more about influencing what we want. What we think is normal, and even who we believe ourselves to be.
Precisely.
It's very subtle.
And a perfect illustration of this is Foucault's concept of biopower, which focuses on how power is exercised over life itself, managing and optimizing both individual bodies and entire populations.
So how does biopower work in practice? Can you give me some concrete examples of this concept in action?
Well, think about public health campaigns. Encouraging you to eat healthy or exercise regularly. Or the way schools and workplaces implement schedules and regulations to optimize productivity. These are all examples of biopower at work, shaping our behaviors and lifestyles.
It's interesting because those examples don't feel oppressive in the traditional sense. They're often presented as being for our own good. For our health and well-being. Exactly. And that's what makes biopower so effective. It's often subtle and even seductive, operating through persuasion and normalization rather than brute force.
Now, speaking of shifts in how power operates, Foucault points out a fascinating transition in Western societies. moving away from this focus on blood and lineage to an analytics of sexuality during like the 19th century.
Yeah.
Can you explain how that ties into this concept of biopower?
Well, it's a shift that might seem unconnected at first glance.
Okay.
But Foucault argues that it's directly tied to the rise of biopower and the growing importance of managing and optimizing life itself.
Okay.
And remember, we're talking about a time of massive social and economic change with the Industrial Revolution in full swing.
So are you saying that managing sexuality became a way to manage these?
It's part of the puzzle.
Okay.
Foucault suggests that this wasn't solely about repressing the sexuality of the working class.
Okay.
Although that certainly happened.
Right. But also about the bourgeoisie affirming and controlling its own sexuality.
Interesting.
As a way to solidify its power and influence.
So it's like flips the script.
Yeah.
On the common idea that the bourgeoisie was all about repressing everyone's sexuality.
Right.
Foucault presents like a much more complex...
It's a much more nuanced dynamic.
Yeah.
Where different social classes were using sexuality in different ways to exert power and control.
To highlight this complexity.
Right.
Foucault contrasts the Marquis de Sade with the early eugenicists.
Yeah.
So de Sade, he argues, represented a figure who clung to the old power structures of blood and sovereignty, linking sex to transgression and rebellion.
Right.
On the other hand, you have like the early eugenicists who saw sex as a tool for social engineering, a way to shape the future of the population and create a supposedly more fit society.
And it's fascinating how Foucault brings together these seemingly disparate figures.
Yeah, to illuminate his points about this shifting nature of power.
It makes you reconsider.
It does.
Some of your own assumptions about the history of sexuality and how it's been shaped by these different forces.
That's the beauty of Foucault's work.
Right.
He encourages us to question what we think we know and to look for those hidden power dynamics at play in seemingly straightforward historical narratives.
Now, a question that comes to mind when reading Foucault is... Is he completely ignoring the biological reality of sex?
Yeah, that's a question a lot of people have when they first encounter Foucault.
Right.
But his argument is actually even more radical than that.
Okay.
He claims that the very concept of sex itself is a historical construct. Something produced by those discourses and power structures we've been talking about.
So he's not saying that our physical bodies or experiences are made up.
No.
But rather that the way we understand and categorize them as sex is a product of our culture and history.
Exactly. He's saying that what we perceive as the truth about sex is actually a carefully constructed narrative.
Okay.
And this narrative, like any narrative, serves certain interests and reinforces existing power dynamics.
It's like he's pulling back the curtain on a stage production, showing us all the wires and the pulleys that make the illusion work.
Exactly.
We think we're seeing something natural and essential, but it's actually a carefully crafted performance designed to create these specific effects.
That's a great analogy.
And to understand how this construction of sex happened, Foucault points to specific strategies that were deployed within this larger system of sexuality.
Right.
So what are some of these strategies?
Well, he talks about the historization of women,
the
sexualization of children, and the psychiatrization of perversions. Each of these played a key role in shaping this idea of sex as this all-encompassing category, bringing certain behaviors, desires, and even identities under its umbrella, and subjecting them to scrutiny and control.
So it sounds like he's saying that our understanding of sex wasn't just handed down from some objective authority, but emerged from these very specific historical practices and power dynamics.
You got it. And he goes on to analyze how each of these strategies, the historization of women, the sexualization of children, and the psychiatrization of perversions functioned within this larger system of sexuality.
So let's break them down one by one.
Okay.
Starting with the historization of women.
Okay.
What exactly does Foucault mean by that?
Well, he's referring to how in the 19th century, women's bodies and behaviors were increasingly medicalized and pathologized. Women's emotions, desires, and even their physical ailments
were often attributed to their reproductive systems or their supposed inherent hysteria.
So it's like women's bodies became this mysterious and dangerous territory that needed to be controlled and regulated by male doctors and scientists.
Exactly.
Okay.
And Foucault argues that this hysterization of women served to reinforce patriarchal power structures and limit women's agency and autonomy.
Now, what about the sexualization of children?
Right.
That's a pretty disturbing concept to think about.
It is, and Foucault is very careful to point out that he's not condoning or celebrating the sexual abuse of children. What he's interested in is how children's sexuality became an object of study and concern in the 19th century.
I can see how that fits into this larger theme of biopower.
Yes.
If you're concerned with managing and optimizing life, then children's development, including their sexual development, becomes like a key focus. Right, and Foucault points out how this focus on children's sexuality often took on a moralistic and disciplinary tone. It wasn't about encouraging children to explore their sexuality in a healthy and informed way, but rather about controlling and regulating their behavior, instilling anxieties and shaping their desires in accordance with societal norms.
So it's another example of how power operates.
Exactly.
Not through outright repression, but through these more subtle and pervasive forms of surveillance and control, often disguised as care and concern.
Precisely. And finally, we have the psychiatrization of perversions, which refers to how certain sexual behaviors, those that fell outside the norms of heterosexual reproduction, were increasingly classified as mental illnesses in the 19th century.
So we're talking about things like homosexuality, fetishism, and sadomasochism. All suddenly labeled as perversions and treated as conditions requiring medical or psychological intervention.
Exactly. And Foucault argues that this psychiatrization of perversions was yet another way to exert control over sexuality and enforce social norms by defining certain behaviors as sick or abnormal. You create a whole system of power and authority around who gets to diagnose, treat, and potentially cure these individuals.
It's a really effective way to marginalize and control people who don't fit into that dominant paradigm of sexuality, making them feel like there's something wrong with them. That needs to be fixed.
And it's not just about individuals. Foucault argues that these strategies had a profound impact on how we understand sexuality as a whole. He suggests that the very categories we use to think about sex, normal, abnormal, heterosexual, homosexual, male, female, are themselves products of these historical power dynamics.
So we're kind of trapped in a system that we didn't create, but that continues to shape our thoughts, our feelings, our behaviors around sex, limiting our possibilities for expression and self-understanding.
That's a very insightful observation.
And it brings us to one of Foucault's most provocative and challenging claims. If sex is not a natural pre-existing category, but a historical construct, what does that tell us about our own understandings of identity and desire?
That is a big question.
It really is. It makes you realize that maybe even our most deeply held beliefs about ourselves, especially when it comes to sexuality and identity, aren't as fixed or natural as we might assume. They might be influenced by these larger historical forces that we're often not even aware of.
And that's precisely what makes Foucault so relevant today, His analysis of how these discourses on sexuality were used to control and regulate populations has major implications for how we understand these contemporary issues like gender identity, sexual liberation, even things like reproductive rights. These aren't just abstract academic debates, They're deeply connected to the ways that power operates in our society.
It's like by understanding the historical roots of these power structures, we can start to challenge them. And create a more just and equitable society.
Exactly.
One where people have the freedom to express themselves, define their own identities, without being constrained by these invisible forces.
It's not about simply rejecting everything Foucault says, but using his work as a lens, through which to critically examine the world around us. It's about asking those tough questions, like who benefits from these particular discourses on sexuality? What are the underlying power dynamics at play? And how can we resist these forces that seek to limit our freedom and autonomy?
it's so empowering to think that we have the agency to question these norms and to create new possibilities for ourselves and future generations. It's not about erasing history, but about understanding it and using that knowledge to build a better future.
Absolutely.
Where sexuality is no longer a tool for control, but a source of liberation and self-expression.
You know, that's a powerful insight.
Yeah.
And it's really at the heart of what Foucault was trying to achieve with his work.
Right.
You know, he wasn't just a historian. He was a philosopher.
Right.
A social critic.
Yeah.
A revolutionary thinker.
He wanted to shake things up.
Yeah.
Challenge the status quo.
Yeah.
Make us think differently about the world and our place in it.
Exactly.
I think he definitely succeeded in that. This deep dive has been a real eye-opener for me.
It has for me as well.
I'm going to be thinking about Foucault's ideas for a long time to come, especially as I navigate these complex conversations about sexuality, identity, and power in my own life.
His work is endlessly fascinating.
It is.
And endlessly relevant.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that knowledge is power.
Right.
And by understanding how power operates, we can start to reclaim our own agency and create a more just and liberated world.
Well said. So, to wrap things up, if Foucault were here with us today, you might ask you this. If sex isn't this natural pre-existing category, but a historical construct, what does that tell you about your own understanding of identity and desire?
That's definitely something to ponder.
It is. And on that note, we want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the complex and thought-provoking world of Michel Foucault.
Thank you.
We hope you've learned something new. Challenged some assumptions.
Absolutely.
And maybe even come away with a few questions of your own.
Yeah.
Until next time, keep those minds curious.
Yes.
And those conversations flowing.